Imagine putting everything on the line: your money, your pride, even your patience, and waiting to see if the odds fall in your favor. Just like a risky bet, sometimes life throws you a challenge where you either win big or lose it all. Today's story is about a man who decided he wasn't going to fold. He played his hand perfectly, and the payout? Priceless. Imagine coming home after a long, exhausting day at work. You're tired, hungry, and all you want is to pull into your driveway, relax inside your home, and leave the stress of the day behind. But instead of parking where you belong, you slam the brakes in frustration because sitting in the middle of your driveway is someone else's car. That was exactly what happened to Marcus. He was a hardworking man who had just moved into what he thought was the perfect suburban neighborhood. For years, he had dreamed of owning his own home. He saved every paycheck, skipped luxuries, and stayed focused until finally his dream came. True, the house wasn't a mansion, but it was his, and he was proud of it. He imagined peace, quiet evenings, and friendly neighbors. But almost immediately after moving in, he discovered that one neighbor was going to make life far more difficult than he ever expected. Her name was Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew she was difficult to deal with, but Marcus hadn't yet learned her ways. On his very first week in the house, he returned from work to find her silver SUV parked smack in the middle of his driveway. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe she confused the driveways. Maybe she had guests and didn't realize where they'd parked. He tried not to overthink it. After all, he was new, and the last thing he wanted was to start off on the wrong foot by arguing with a neighbor. So, instead of fuming in silence, Marcus decided to handle things politely. He walked up to her door and knocked, waiting for a simple apology and for her to move her car. When Karen opened the door, she didn't look embarrassed or surprised. In fact, she looked almost amused. Marcus kept his voice calm. "Hi, I think you might have parked in the wrong driveway," he explained. "That spot over there is mine." Karen smirked, tilted her head, and shrugged. "Oh, don't worry," she said with a dismissive tone. "It's just more convenient for me. You've got plenty of space anyway." Marcus stood there for a moment, stunned. Did she really just say that? This wasn't about convenience. This was his driveway on his property. Still, not wanting to make waves during his very first week in the neighborhood, he forced a smile and left it at that. Eventually, she moved the car, and Marcus thought maybe that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, the same silver SUV was back, sitting in his driveway like it belonged there. This time, Marcus was more frustrated. He marched over to her house and knocked again, more firmly than before. When Karen opened the door, she didn't look apologetic at all. She looked annoyed, like he was the problem. "Karen," Marcus said, in a steady but firm voice, "you can't keep parking in my driveway. That's my space. I need you to move your car and stop doing this." She crossed her arms and smirked again. "Actually," she said in a smug tone, "I'm on the HOA board. That gives me certain privileges. Besides, you're new here. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Privileges? Since when did being part of the HOA mean she could claim someone else's driveway? It was ridiculous. But in that moment, he realized the kind of person he was dealing with. Karen wasn't confused. She wasn't careless. She was entitled. She believed the rules didn't apply to her, and worse, she thought she could intimidate him into staying quiet because he was new to the neighborhood. Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his cool. He wasn't about to lose his temper, not yet. Instead, he started planning. If Karen thought she could use her HOA position as a shield, Marcus knew he needed to be smart. From that day forward, every time her SUV appeared in his driveway, Marcus took pictures. He noted the time, the date, and even recorded short clips as proof. He didn't argue with her again. He didn't warn her again. He knew there would come a time when that evidence would be useful. At first, he hoped the problem would fade away, that maybe after a couple of warnings she'd stop. But with each day that passed, Marcus realized that Karen wasn't going to stop on her own. In her mind, her convenience mattered more than his property rights. She believed that because she had a little bit of authority in the neighborhood, she could walk all over him. What she didn't know was that Marcus wasn't the type to let himself be pushed around. He was patient, yes, but he was also determined, and as the days went on and Karen kept parking in his driveway, Marcus's patience slowly started to run out. He was tired of carrying groceries across the street because she blocked his space. He was tired of pretending her arrogance didn't bother him. Most of all, he was tired of her smirk, the one that said she thought she'd won before the fight even began. What Karen didn't realize was that Marcus was quietly preparing for the day he would turn the tables, and when he did, it would be a lesson she would never forget. The problem didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. Days later, Marcus came home once again to find Karen's silver SUV sitting squarely in his driveway. He clenched his jaw in frustration. At first, he thought maybe she hadn't gotten the message the first time, but when it happened again and then again, Marcus realized this wasn't some careless mistake. It was deliberate. The third time it happened, Marcus decided he wasn't going to stay silent. He walked over to her door, knocked firmly, and waited. When Karen opened the door, she already had that same smug look on her face, the one that made it clear she thought she was in control of the situation. "Ma'am, this is my driveway," Marcus said, his tone more serious this time. "You can't keep leaving your car here." Karen didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. Instead, she rolled her eyes as if he was being dramatic. Then she gave a little laugh and crossed her arms. "Actually," she said in a condescending tone, "as a member of the HOA, I have certain privileges. Besides, you're new here. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus stared at her, stunned at the arrogance dripping from her voice. She really believed she could do whatever she wanted. Simply because she sat on the HOA board, that's when it clicked for Marcus. This wasn't about parking at all. Karen wanted to remind him that she held power in the neighborhood and that he, as the new guy and the only black homeowner on the street, was expected to fall in line. She thought intimidation and authority would be enough to silence him. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to be bullied. He didn't argue back. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he simply nodded and walked away. To Karen, it probably looked like a victory. She probably thought he had backed down, that her little speech about privileges had scared him into submission. But Marcus knew better. He understood that people like Karen thrived on drama. They wanted yelling matches, heated arguments, and chaos they could twist to make themselves look like the victim. So Marcus chose a different strategy. He would be quiet, patient, and precise. From that day on, he began documenting everything. Every time Karen's SUV appeared in his driveway, Marcus pulled out his phone and snapped pictures. Wide shots that showed the SUV parked squarely on his property, close-up shots of the license plate. He made sure the timestamps were clear and easy to verify. He kept a small notebook in his car and wrote down the dates and times of each incident. If she moved her car after hours, he jotted it down. If she left it there all night, he wrote that too. At first, it felt almost silly, like he was overreacting. But Marcus knew better. He knew that when dealing with people who abuse power, the best weapon you could have was undeniable evidence. Words could be twisted, but pictures and timestamps couldn't lie. Karen, of course, kept acting like nothing was wrong. When Marcus saw her outside, she gave him little smirks, the kind that said, "I own this place." Sometimes she would wave sarcastically as if to remind him she wasn't afraid of him or his complaints. To her, this was a game, a way to show dominance. Marcus refused to take the bait. He didn't wave back. He didn't yell. He didn't call her out in front of the neighbors. He just kept collecting proof, waiting for the right moment. Privately, though, he was fuming. Every time he had to park down the street because her SUV was blocking his driveway, his patience wore thinner. Every time he carried heavy bags of groceries farther than necessary, he grew more frustrated. And every time he saw her smirk, he reminded himself, "Be patient. Your time will come." Karen had no idea that Marcus was building a case against her. She probably thought he was harmless, that he was too quiet, too polite to stand up for himself. She believed her role in the HOA gave her untouchable power. She thought she had found someone she could walk all over, but Marcus wasn't weak. He was strategic. He started reading the own rulebook line by line, studying every section about parking, property rights, and trespassing. He wanted to be absolutely sure that when the moment came, he would have every fact on his side. And the more he read, the more he realized something important. Karen was breaking rules left and right. Rules she was supposed to enforce as a board member. The irony made Marcus laugh to himself. The same privileges Karen bragged about actually made her more vulnerable if she got caught abusing them. She was supposed to set the example, not break the rules. So Marcus kept documenting. Each picture, each note in his journal, each little smirk she threw his way, it all added fuel to the fire. He wasn't just protecting his driveway anymore. He was preparing for justice. Karen thought she was untouchable. But Marcus was about to show her what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. One evening, Marcus came home exhausted after another long day at work. His body ached, his mind was tired, and all he wanted was to finally relax at home. But as he pulled up to his driveway, he froze in frustration. There it was again, Karen's silver SUV, sitting right in the middle of his driveway like she had every right to be there. Marcus sighed deeply, gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't just inconvenient anymore, it was infuriating. He had to park down the street, juggle his groceries, and trek across the block to reach his front door. Every step reminded him that Karen didn't respect boundaries, property, or basic courtesy. The sheer audacity of it was maddening. For a moment, Marcus considered just letting it go, thinking about all the times he had stayed calm and polite. But no, he had tried the gentle approach, the patient approach, even the understanding approach. Karen had shown him that none of it worked. Today he realized it was time to take action. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the local towing company. The call was quick, and soon a tow truck rumbled down the street, the engine growling like a warning. The driver parked next to the SUV and gave Marcus a skeptical look. "Are you sure you want me to tow it?" the driver asked. Marcus didn't hesitate. His voice was calm but firm. "Yes, I've asked her politely more than once. She won't listen." "Tow it," the driver nodded, clearly used to situations like this, and began attaching the SUV to the truck. Marcus watched, a mix of relief and satisfaction flooding through him. Every inch of the SUV being lifted from his driveway felt like justice being served. He could almost hear Karen's smirk disappearing along with her car. As the tow truck drove off, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't about revenge, exactly. It was about asserting his rights, standing up for himself, and making it clear that his property was his. The neighborhood had rules, and Karen had ignored them one too many times. Finally, someone was holding her accountable. Later that night, just as Marcus was settling into his living room with a cup of tea, there was a frantic pounding on his door. He looked through the peephole to see Karen, her face red with fury, hands shaking as she knocked harder and harder. He knew immediately what was coming. "Marcus, how dare you?" she shouted, her voice high-pitched with anger. "You had my car towed." "Do you know who I am?" Marcus didn't open the door immediately. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that anger was exactly what Karen wanted. It was a trap to make him lose his composure. He opened the door just enough to speak calmly, maintaining his cool. "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "And I also know this is my property. Don't park in my driveway again." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. She sputtered, trying to find words, but Marcus didn't let her interrupt. He closed the door slowly, leaving her outside, seething with frustration. For the first time, she realized her intimidation tactics weren't going to work on him. The following day, Marcus noticed some of the neighbors were already talking. Word spread quickly in the community. People had seen the tow truck, and they knew who had the last laugh. Some gave him approving nods as he watered his lawn. Others whispered behind Karen's back. For once, it seemed, public opinion was on his side. Karen, of course, tried to fight back. She complained to other HOA members, claiming Marcus had harassed her and asking for the towing fee to be reimbursed. But Marcus was prepared. He had pictures, timestamps, and even written records of every time she had blocked his driveway. The evidence was undeniable. The HOA board reviewed everything carefully. And the verdict was clear. Karen had broken multiple rules. She was fined for repeated violations, and a warning was issued that her actions would not be tolerated in the future. The board reminded her that no HOA position gave her the right to ignore property laws. From that day on, Karen never parked in Marcus's driveway again. Marcus finally had the peace he deserved. Every time he pulled into his driveway, he could relax without fear of another confrontation. The lesson was clear. Patience, preparation, and standing up for yourself can make even the most entitled people think twice. And as for Karen, her reputation suffered. The neighbors, once wary of her temper, now shook their heads at her arrogance. Marcus didn't gloat, but he couldn't help feeling a quiet satisfaction knowing that justice had been served not through shouting, arguing, or escalating the situation, but through calm, methodical action. That SUV might have caused him countless headaches. But in the end, it was the thing that allowed him to show Karen and the entire neighborhood that boundaries were not just suggestions. They were rules. And no one, no matter how entitled, could ignore them. Most people, after being towed once, would have learned their lesson. But Karen? Not a chance. A week later, Marcus came home from work to the same infuriating sight, her silver SUV parked squarely in his driveway once again, as if the previous tow had never happened. Marcus stared at it for a moment, a mix of disbelief and amusement crossing his face. He shook his head slowly, thinking about how some people simply refuse to learn. This time, Marcus didn't even consider knocking on her door. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to beg, and certainly didn't want to waste another second dealing with her arrogance. Instead, he smiled to himself, pulled out his phone, and dialed the tow company once more. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing the same driver would return for round two. When the tow truck rolled up the block, the driver jumped out and waved at Marcus with a grin. "Wait a second," he said, chuckling. "Didn't we just tow this same car last week?" Marcus laughed, the sound low and amused. "Yep," he replied. "Guess some people really need to learn the hard way." The driver shook his head, clearly entertained, and began hooking up Karen's SUV again. Meanwhile, Marcus leaned against his mailbox, watching the familiar scene unfold. He had to admit it was oddly satisfying seeing Karma at work, even if it was just a tow truck doing its job inside her house. Karen noticed the tow truck pulling up and immediately realized what was happening. She bolted from her front door, shrieking at the top of her lungs. "What are you doing?" she screamed, waving her hands frantically. "That's my car. You can't tow it. This is harassment." Her voice carried across the street, drawing curious glances from neighbors who had begun to notice the ongoing drama between Marcus and Karen. Some peered through their blinds. Others stepped outside, whispering and shaking their heads. It wasn't every day that a suburban street became the setting for such an audacious showdown. Karen ran closer, trying to block the tow truck or intimidate Marcus directly, but the driver stayed calm. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "he's the homeowner. This is his driveway. You are trespassing." Karen's face turned bright red with fury. Her mouth opened and closed as if she were trying to form some clever retort, but nothing came out. Marcus, meanwhile, stayed perfectly calm. He watched her flail and rant, the corners of his mouth twitching in amusement. Finally, he said nothing, letting the tow truck do the talking. The truck's hydraulic lift roared to life, and slowly, the SUV began to rise off the ground. Karen backed away, waving her hands and shouting threats about calling the police, about suing, about how dare he, all of it falling flat. The neighborhood could hear her shrieks as the SUV was securely hooked and slowly driven away down the street for the second time. As the tow truck disappeared, Marcus noticed something remarkable. People were starting to talk. Neighbors who had previously avoided the drama or whispered about Karen behind closed doors now nodded in approval at Marcus as he walked down his driveway. One neighbor, an older man tending his garden, called out, "Good for you, someone needed to put her in her place." Others gave small smiles or even waved in solidarity. For once, Marcus wasn't the new guy being intimidated, he was the one commanding respect. Meanwhile, Karen retreated back into her house, seething. She slammed her door and muttered under her breath about unfairness, harassment, and the audacity of Marcus. But outside, the subtle power shift was already clear. She had tried to intimidate him through entitlement, through her HOA board position, and through sheer audacity, but Marcus had shown her that patience, preparation, and calm determination could triumph over arrogance. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving she was wrong in front of the entire street, though that was a nice bonus. It was about standing up for himself, reclaiming his space, and showing that he would not be pushed around. The tow truck had simply been the tool that delivered justice, and seeing Karen humiliated by her own behavior was an unspoken reminder that entitlement doesn't go unchallenged forever. From that day forward, the silver SUV never returned to his driveway. Karen finally learned her lesson the hard way, that property boundaries aren't suggestions, and that no one, no matter how entitled, can claim ownership over someone else's hard-earned space. Marcus, on the other hand, could finally walk into his home, set down his keys, and enjoy the quiet he had worked so hard to achieve, knowing that sometimes patience and evidence are the best forms of justice. The street returned to its normal rhythm, but the story spread quietly. Neighbors shared smiles and whispers, impressed by Marcus's calm and strategic way of handling someone who thought rules didn't apply to them. For him, the victory was private but profound. He had faced entitlement, stood his ground, and won not with anger or shouting, but with patience, evidence, and the right call to the tow truck. After the second tow, Karen was furious, and she wasn't going to let the situation end quietly. She stormed into the HOA office, her face red with anger, and demanded to speak with anyone in charge. "This is harassment," she insisted, waving her hands dramatically. "Marcus is targeting me unfairly. He's out to ruin me." The board members exchanged glances, some suppressing smirks, but Marcus was prepared. He had anticipated this exact move. Calmly, he presented his evidence. Photographs showing Karen's SUV in his driveway, timestamps detailing each violation, and the official tow records from the company. Every incident, every moment she had parked illegally, was documented and undeniable. The board members reviewed everything meticulously. Karen tried to argue, to twist the situation in her favor, but the proof was overwhelming. It was clear she had repeatedly trespassed on Marcus's property, despite being warned multiple times. The HOA had rules about parking, about respecting property lines, and about board members upholding standards, not breaking them. In the end, the HOA had no choice but to side with Marcus. Karen was fined for repeated violations, a substantial amount that left her sputtering in disbelief. She was reminded in no uncertain terms that her board membership did not grant her the right to ignore the rules or to claim someone else's driveway as her own. Word of the HOA's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood. Karen, who had once wielded her status like a shield, suddenly found herself on the receiving end of whispers and judgmental glances. People who had once avoided confrontation with her began to distance themselves. Those who had tolerated her rude remarks and controlling behavior now rolled their eyes when she appeared. Sharing knowing looks with one another, she was no longer the queen bee of the HOA, no longer untouchable. Her reputation, carefully cultivated over years, had crumbled almost overnight. Every smirk, every arrogant remark she had made to neighbors had come back to haunt her. The same people who once feared her now quietly chuckled at her attempts to regain authority, recognizing that Marcus had exposed her for exactly what she was, entitled and unwilling to respect others. For Marcus, the change in the neighborhood atmosphere was noticeable immediately. No longer did he have to worry about blocked driveways or unexpected confrontations. He could pull into his space, park his car, and walk inside without the tension of wondering whether Karen had decided to make his life inconvenient again. The peace he had longed for finally settled over his home, and with it came the quiet satisfaction of victory. But Marcus's satisfaction wasn't fueled by malice. It was simple justice. He had stood up for himself, had gathered his evidence methodically, and had responded in a way that was firm yet measured. There was a sense of triumph not in humiliating Karen, but in asserting his rights and ensuring that the rules applied equally to everyone, no matter their position or status in the community. And the best part, Karen never ever parked in his driveway again. After the HOA ruling and her repeated humiliation, she seemed to understand, finally, that her behavior had consequences. Marcus could hardly believe it when weeks passed and the SUV stayed in her own driveway. It was almost surreal to experience what he had fought so hard to achieve: uninterrupted peace, the freedom to enjoy his home without interference, and the reassurance that standing up for oneself works, even against someone so brazenly entitled. The story of Marcus and Karen became a quiet legend in the neighborhood. People told the tale not as gossip, but as an example of standing up for your rights, with dignity and patience. Sometimes, they said, justice doesn't come in the courtroom, doesn't come with a lawyer's letter or a formal lawsuit. Sometimes it comes in the form of persistence, preparation, and yes, a tow truck, twice. Marcus often thought back to the first day Karen had parked in his driveway, smiling smugly as if she owned the block. He remembered the frustration, the disbelief, and the patience it took to handle her with grace. And yet, the memory was no longer bitter, it was satisfying. Every photograph, every note, every careful record he had taken had led to this moment. A neighborhood finally free of unnecessary tension. A home he could enjoy without fear, and a lesson that sometimes doing the right thing quietly and consistently yields the most powerful results. In the end, Marcus learned something invaluable. Patience, evidence, and calm action are stronger than anger and entitlement. Karen may have thought she was untouchable, but life and sometimes the law, enforced in small but meaningful ways, has a way of leveling the playing field. Marcus had claimed his space, protected his rights, and quietly restored balance to his corner of the neighborhood. The SUV sat in Karen's own driveway from that day forward, a silent reminder that no one is above the rules and that respect for others is not optional. And as Marcus pulled into his driveway each evening, he smiled, knowing he had won a victory not just for himself but for fairness, dignity, and justice. Sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom, it just needs patience, proof, and a little persistence. Marcus proved that standing up for yourself always pays off. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more amazing stories like this.